From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Urban Outlook.
Well, hello and welcome to Urban Outlook. I'm April Eaton. Thank you for being with us today. You may have heard of a new White House initiative called My Brother's Keeper. In February of this year, President Barack Obama rolled out a program, a 5-year one, $200 million, to address the disparities faced by African American, Hispanic, and other boys of color. Some of those disparities include gaps in the way that boys live in poverty. Some of those percentages in the mid 20% range. Roughly 2/3 of Black and 1/3 of Hispanic children live with only one parent. Those one-parent households, of course, sometimes lead to those students dropping out of high school. 75% of Black boys and Hispanic boys, to the tune of 96%, often drop out before they get to any other education. As we know, this path of poverty and the lack of education leads to unemployment. It leads to kids who can't go to college, and sometimes it leads to worse places, young boys getting in trouble, ending up in prison. Mr. Obama, of course, wants young people to reach their full potential, and he's charging cities and communities and schools across the country with finding some solutions. Well, Nashville Metro Public Schools is not immune to any of the things that are going on. In fact, they're working on lots of solutions, have a number of programs that have been in place for quite some time now. So we thought we would bring back one of our experts in education, Tony Majors. He is the Chief Support Services Officer for Metro Public Schools. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm glad to be here.
And as we said, we're trying to find some solutions to the things that plague particularly our African American and boys of color. Metro Public Schools has a number of programs in place, but one is called Passage. Could be a possible solution to some of the things we're seeing out there with our young people. Talk a little bit about what Passage means and what the program does.
Well, as you stated, that our school system is very fortunate in that we have implemented multiple programs looking at providing direct service and support for students and their families. But Passage basically stands for Positive and Safe Schools Advancing Greater Equity. It is a program or initiative, not a program, funded by Atlantic Philanthropy that is being implemented by the Annenberg Institute out of Brown University. And it is basically a 4-city collaborative that includes Nashville, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, in which we are really working with our community and our partner or sister cities to address the issues of discipline disparities that exist in schools.
You look at those cities that we're talking about: New York, #1, Los Angeles, Chicago, #3. How does little old Nashville fit in? Are we seeing some of those same problems that major metropolitan schools in those large cities are seeing?
Well, of course, our 3 partner cities in this initiative are very large school systems, but just like we're seeing the same trends nationally, Nashville is having and dealing with the same issue of discipline disparities for children of color.
What's happening, Tony, in our schools that we've got this disparity going on? I mean, if a kid acts up, we expect there to be some kind of a punishment, right? But is it that teachers are seeing behaviors differently based on what color that child is?
Well, I think the simple answer is there is no one answer. It's all of the above. I think we do have to begin with looking at teachers, how teachers interact with students, the relationships that they build with our children, and then how do they respond when our children begin to exhibit behaviors that are not conducive to the learning environment. But we also have to look at the needs of the children and the needs of the family. Yeah. So it's a holistic approach to addressing discipline disparities, in which we will be looking at the classroom management practices of our teachers. We will also be looking at the disciplinary practices of our administrators, to which degree they are levying or utilizing suspension and expulsion as consequences for our students. But we will also be taking deep and detailed looks at our students themselves, asking students, what are the issues that you're facing? What are the things that are leading to your behavior outbursts in the classroom? And of course, Passage is designed to look at children of color, but at the same time, we're going to be looking at our discipline practices for all children, but we will be intently looking at the disciplinary practices and the use of suspension and expulsion for children of color.
Because the reality is there's got to be some accountability, right? A kid has to be accountable for his or her own behavior. And if they're acting out, that makes it unfortunate for the entire classroom, because that teacher then has to deviate her time or his time and focus on what's happening right in front of them as opposed to teaching. So how do you make sure that that student and that those parents of the student are held accountable for those behaviors that may be happening in the classroom?
Well, it's important that you bring that up, because one of the greatest misconceptions about any time you start work looking at discipline disparities is that you're going to sacrifice the safety of the learning environment. Passage is not designed to do that.
Okay.
We will be looking at our codes, our policies, our practices, and our procedures, but we will not sacrifice school safety. Consequences will still be given for inappropriate behavior. What we don't want to see is the disproportionate use of disciplinary consequences, where one child in one school receives one consequence while a child in another school that commits the same infraction receives a totally different and then more severe consequence. So it's not about allowing students to have a free pass for their behavior. It's about how do we support them so, number one, they don't exhibit the behavior, but also how do we assist them and provide consequences that are appropriate for their infraction.
But it also sounds like you take away that wiggle room too, right? So the rule is the rule is the rule is what it sounds like you're trying to get to, so that you do have that consistency across the schools, but not all students are the same. So maybe it's the same infraction, but one student has done it only one time, and another student maybe has done it multiple times. One student may be on the honor roll while the other student is not. How do you work out all those little details like that?
Well, honor roll versus not honor roll is not fair and equitable.
I know.
So that would not be a measure that we would use. But what I would say is that when we look at the scenario that you just gave us, it's really more about this is the student, this is the infraction. If the student has created the had offended the same infraction more than one time or multiple times, then there's another code for that. That's repeated violations of the same disciplinary incident. So it's not exactly...
Puts them in a different bucket altogether.
And it's not as rigid as you would think. There's a great deal of flexibility in how our administrators are given the autonomy to levy discipline when dealing with students. So it's really, the codes are very rigid. They're clearly laid out in the Student Code of Conduct, but the degree to which principals utilize disciplinary consequences when those codes have been violated, that's where you have the wiggle room, as you stated, or the flexibility to look at the individual child, to look at the individual circumstance, and then make the appropriate decision.
How big of a factor is that child's background, where they come from, for instance? Because we know, as I read some of the statistics earlier, you know, there are kids that are living in poverty, there are kids that only have one parent in the household, there may be kids with no parents in the household. They're in some pretty trying situations out there, and that's got to have an impact on how they behave, not just in school, but in society, period. What kind of weight does that get? Not that they should get a bye, right? But that shows you some of the causes to what may be plaguing them.
So that is a conversation that's going to be much longer than the time we have, but I'm going to really try and get to the heart of what you ask.
Yeah.
Every child should be given a blank slate every time they start the school year. When they walk into a classroom, it should be an equal playing field for all children. Everyone has access to the same resources and being given the same opportunities to learn and excel in the instructional setting. But that being said, we would not be professionals if we did not recognize that some of our children enter the school every day with a higher degree of needs than others. That is why some of the other things that we're doing in the district are so important. We have what we call the cluster support model, which means we have K-12 feeder pattern. So let's say it's McGavick High School. So every elementary and middle school that feeds McGavick High School would be considered the McGavick cluster. So we already have social workers, behavior specialists, family involvement specialists, community outreach specialists that just work with those schools within that cluster and the teachers and administrators and parents within those schools. We use what we call an early warning system, or we call them a flag system in our data management. So every year we compile those students that were truant, that had 5 or more days of unexcused absence, those students that had a high rate of disciplinary referrals, those students that had suspension and expulsions, and then students that had been previously referred for other type of socio-emotional needs. We immediately begin making contact with those children within the first 2 or 3 weeks of school, so that then we're putting the support services in place or continuing the services from the previous year to help that child be successful. And one thing that's really important for everyone to understand is teachers and principals are charged with so much on a day-to-day basis. You know, you have 25 to 30 children in the classroom of varying degrees of intellect and different levels of socio-emotional needs. So there's a great deal of responsibility being placed on our teachers and our principals. It is the responsibility of others, including MNPS employees, but also the community, to start being more actively involved in the lives of our children and their families, because at the end of the day, it's not just about the academic outcome, it's about the overall health of our city in the future, because our young children, if we meet their needs now, will be much more productive citizens in Nashville in the future.
Absolutely. Now, I heard you say something, and I'm going to go back to this, because the flagging of a student that has had some trying times coming up through the school system is all well and good when the outcome is a positive one, making sure those social workers are there, making sure those programs are there. But flagging could sometimes, some might say, lead to tracking that student. So setting that student up to already be a kid coming into that new school or wherever he or she is coming into with a label that they're a bad kid. How do you keep that from happening?
So I am not aware of principals using the flagging system or teachers using the flagging system to isolate or track students. When I speak to our at-risk indicators, I am speaking to the support services staff, our employees that want to know which kids, who are the students that we need to make immediate contact with to help them transition into the next school year. So I have not, fortunately, I have not dealt with one incident in the last 3 or 4 years in which I've heard of a teacher or a principal tracking a student based on the data from the previous year in a negative way. We use the data to help streamline the delivery of services and supports to the children and their families.
Gotcha. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, talk a little bit more about Passage, but also I want to kind of update people on another program that we talked about not long ago, and that's dads in the schools, roaming the halls and taking care.
Dads.
That's right. Let's
That's right.
update people on that as well. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us.